Harlem, New York. It was 8:15 p.m., Thursday evening, September 19th, 1935. A light autumn chill moved between the buildings, carrying cigarette smoke and jazz drifting out from Lenox Avenue. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped onto the sidewalk outside the Cotton Club, wearing a tailored navy suit, white shirt pressed sharp, shoes polished to a mirror shine. The streetlights reflected off the chrome of parked cars as laughter spilled from inside. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. What happened at that door lasted less than a minute, but by the end of the week, it would quietly redraw the balance of power in Harlem and leave several men dead. The Cotton Club sat on 142nd Street like a polished illusion. Neon lights hummed above its entrance, promising glamour to anyone allowed inside. White patrons lined up beneath the marquee, laughing, coats draped over arms, tickets folded neatly in their hands. Inside, nearly 200 guests filled the room. Duke Ellington's orchestra was already warming up, brass instruments glinting under stage lights. Outside, Harlem told a different story. The sidewalks were crowded with men looking for work, women carrying groceries home from corner markets, children darting between parked cars. Harlem in 1935 was vibrant, loud, and alive, but it was also poor, segregated, and watched closely by police who did not live there. This was the world Ellsworth Johnson ruled without a title. Known to most as Bumpy for the scarred ridge on the back of his head, Johnson was already a legend by his early 30s. He was not the loudest gangster in New York. He did not flaunt his power. He read Shakespeare, quoted philosophy, and preferred chess to cards. But everyone in Harlem knew the truth. Nothing illegal moved through the neighborhood without his permission. Numbers gambling, protection rackets, underground alcohol distribution, all of it passed through him. Yet for all his power, Johnson remained a black man in a city structured to remind him daily where the limits were supposed to be. The Cotton Club was one of those limits. Though it stood in the heart of Harlem, the club operated under a strict whites-only policy for patrons. Black musicians played on stage, black servers worked the floor, but black customers, even the most powerful ones, were not welcome past the door. The doorman that night was Thomas Murphy, a large man with a stiff collar and a reputation for enforcing rules without hesitation. Murphy had turned people away before, but this night was different. The man standing in front of him was not a drunk, not a troublemaker, not an outsider. It was Bumpy Johnson. Johnson had come to meet a Jewish businessman connected to liquor distribution, a man looking to expand operations north of Midtown. It was business, nothing theatrical, nothing personal. Johnson arrived alone, calm, composed, hands visible at his sides. Murphy did not lower his voice. Witnesses later recalled the moment as awkward, even uncomfortable. The music paused briefly inside. A few patrons near the door turned their heads. Murphy blocked the entrance and told Johnson he could not come in. The words he used were not shouted, but they were unmistakably dismissive. Language rooted in segregation, reinforced by law and sharpened by habit. Johnson did not respond. He looked at Murphy for several seconds, his expression unreadable. No threats, no argument, no raised hand. Then he turned, walked back toward the street, and disappeared into the crowd. To onlookers, it seemed uneventful, another quiet humiliation in a city full of them. But Harlem understood something others did not. Silence from Bumpy Johnson was never surrender. It was calculation. Johnson's authority came from a delicate balance. He enforced order among Harlem's criminals, but he also acted as a mediator between gangs, between communities, and sometimes between the neighborhood and the police. He paid lawyers for men who could not afford them. He gave money to families after funerals. He settled disputes before they spilled into open violence. That power depended on respect, and respect, once publicly denied, demanded a response. Johnson did not return home immediately that night. He walked several blocks, stopped at a small bar frequented by trusted associates, and ordered a drink. He said little. According to later accounts, he listened more than he spoke. Names were mentioned, businesses discussed, routes traced. The Cotton Club incident was not about personal pride. It was about precedent. If one door could be closed to him publicly, others would follow. And if Harlem's most powerful man could be humiliated without consequence, the message would travel fast through police precincts, rival gangs, and business owners who relied on black money but denied black dignity. By the time Johnson left the bar, the response had already begun to take shape. Not violent, not impulsive, but systematic. A countdown had started, quietly. The morning after the Cotton Club incident, Harlem woke up unchanged on the surface. Storefronts opened, street vendors set up carts, children walked to school, jazz records spun behind dusty windows. But beneath that routine, information was moving. By noon, word had reached nearly every numbers runner on Lenox Avenue. By nightfall, bar owners, policy bankers, and delivery drivers understood the message clearly, without anyone ever saying it aloud. Business with the Cotton Club was no longer neutral. Johnson did not issue statements. He did not call meetings. He did not threaten retaliation. Instead, he began with something far more dangerous: coordination. Harlem's underground economy depended on trust and repetition. The same men collected bets every day. The same drivers delivered alcohol. The same shop owners extended credit quietly, knowing repayment would come. Johnson knew that disrupting this rhythm, even slightly, could cause damage far beyond a single target. The first step was withdrawal. Liquor deliveries scheduled for the Cotton Club were delayed, then quietly cancelled. The distributors did not explain why. They did not have to. Replacement suppliers were harder to find than the club expected, especially ones willing to operate under the same terms. At the same time, Johnson's people spoke privately with local performers and service workers. No threats were made. They were reminded, politely, who paid their legal fees when police raids went wrong, who helped families when wages disappeared. Within days, several musicians declined short-notice gigs at the club. A few servers failed to show up for shifts. Nothing dramatic, just enough disruption to be noticed. The Cotton Club management responded the way institutions often do, by blaming logistics. Advertisements continued. The music played on. The door policy remained unchanged. They assumed the incident had passed. Johnson, meanwhile, widened the circle. He instructed his lieutenants to compile a list, not of enemies, but of dependencies. Which vendors relied on Harlem customers? Which banks extended informal credit to club-affiliated businesses? Which landlords owned multiple properties and could not afford prolonged vacancies? This was not revenge driven by anger. It was pressure built through knowledge. Johnson had spent years cultivating relationships that crossed racial and economic boundaries. Jewish merchants, Italian wholesalers, independent truckers, men who cared less about ideology and more about stability. To them, Johnson was not a radical figure, he was a guarantor, and now that guarantee was quietly withdrawn. Within a week, rumors reached downtown Manhattan. Club accountants began noticing irregularities. Revenue was steady, but expenses climbed. Replacement suppliers charged more. Insurance inquiries stalled. A minor inspection was scheduled, then another. No single problem threatened the business. Together, they formed a pattern. Somewhere in this sequence, the club's owners became aware that the problem was not technical, it was relational, and relationships in Harlem followed different rules than those printed on contracts. Still, the door remained closed. To admit error publicly would have meant acknowledging dependence on a man they had refused to let inside. Johnson waited. He attended neighborhood events, paid for groceries for families struggling through the Depression, spoke at no rallies, gave no interviews. His calm presence reassured his community while unsettling those watching from a distance. The countdown was not measured in days on a calendar. It was measured in missed payments, empty shifts, and growing unease. And then something shifted. A rival bookmaker, aligned loosely with downtown interests, attempted to move operations into Harlem, assuming Johnson was distracted. The attempt lasted less than 48 hours. The man was not harmed. He was simply isolated. No one took his bets. No one returned his calls. The message was clear. Johnson's control had not weakened. It had sharpened. By the end of the second week, Cotton Club management requested a private meeting with intermediaries connected to Harlem's informal economy. Not with Johnson directly. Not yet. They wanted to understand what had changed and how to reverse it. Johnson declined the invitation, not because he could not attend, but because the balance had not shifted enough. The humiliation had been public. The response, he believed, needed to be equally visible, but delivered without spectacle. Only then would it matter. By the third week after the Cotton Club incident, the pressure was no longer invisible. The club was still open, the music still played, but the room no longer felt invincible. Attendance dipped on weeknights. Performers rotated more frequently. Management meetings grew longer, quieter, and more urgent. Then came the mistake. A downtown numbers operator, working loosely under Dutch Schultz's network, was spotted collecting bets on the edge of Harlem. He was not discreet. He assumed protection from white syndicate backing would be enough. Johnson heard about it before noon. That evening, he invited a mutual intermediary to sit with him in a small back room above a bar on 7th Avenue. No raised voices, no threats, just a statement delivered evenly. This was not about territory. This was about respect. The message was simple and chilling in its clarity. Harlem was closed. Anyone operating without consent would be removed, quietly at first. The intermediary understood what that meant. The following morning, the downtown operator did not return to work. He was found alive, shaken, and cooperative, having been warned in unmistakable terms. No violence, no spectacle. But the clock had started. Johnson did not announce a deadline publicly. He did not need to. Harlem ran on shared understanding, and the understanding was this: every violation would be answered one by one, until the message reached the people who believed they were untouchable. Within days, Schultz's men began pulling out of Harlem, not because they had been attacked, but because the environment had become hostile to survival. No suppliers, no runners, no safe houses. Every door that had once been open was now closed. This was not chaos, it was isolation. Only then did Johnson agree to meet. The location was neutral, a private dining room, far from Harlem, chosen for discretion rather than comfort. Present were intermediaries from both sides, businessmen, not soldiers. Johnson arrived on time, sat down, spoke calmly. He did not demand apologies. He did not ask for favors. He laid out consequences. Harlem would remain inaccessible to outside operations unless certain conditions were met. Local autonomy would be respected, economic participation would be reciprocal, and no establishment operating in Harlem, including the Cotton Club, would be allowed to profit from black labor while denying black presence. The room was silent. Those listening understood that this was not a negotiation born of anger. It was policy. News of the meeting spread quickly, though details remained vague. What mattered was the outcome. Within weeks, the Cotton Club quietly adjusted its practices. The door policy softened, not publicly, not ceremonially, but practically. Meetings with Harlem representatives followed. Financial relationships were repaired. The club survived, but it did so on different terms. More importantly, Schultz's influence north of 110th Street collapsed entirely. He would leave New York not long after. His power diminished, his enemies multiplied. His death would come later, in another city, under different circumstances. But the turning point had already passed. For Johnson, the victory was not marked by celebration. It was marked by stability. Harlem remained under his control, not through fear alone, but through structure. The humiliation that had once threatened his authority had instead clarified it. Publicly, nothing dramatic had happened. Privately, everything had changed. The lesson was understood far beyond Harlem. Power did not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrived quietly, through closed doors, unanswered calls, and the slow realization that you no longer belonged where you once moved freely. Johnson never spoke publicly about the Cotton Club incident. He did not need to. The city remembered it for him. The weeks that followed did not bring celebration. They brought adjustment. Harlem settled into a new equilibrium, one shaped less by visible force than by understood boundaries. Businesses reopened lines of credit. Deliveries resumed under revised terms. Outside operators stayed away, not because they feared violence, but because the cost of entry had become unsustainable. The Cotton Club survived the transition, but it never regained the illusion of untouchability it once enjoyed. Its ownership learned a quiet lesson common to institutions built on exclusion. Survival often depends not on dominance, but on accommodation. The door that had once been a symbol of racial certainty became instead a liability to be managed discreetly. No public apology was issued. None was expected. The message had already landed. For Dutch Schultz, the retreat from Harlem marked the beginning of the end. His authority, once reinforced by reputation alone, eroded as allies reassessed risk. Men who had followed him out of fear began looking elsewhere for protection. His operations fragmented, then contracted. When Schultz was eventually killed in Newark, the headlines focused on the brutality of the act, not its origins. But among those who understood the geography of power, the chain of events was clear. Harlem had been the line. Crossing it without consent had accelerated his collapse. Johnson did not comment on Schultz's death. He rarely commented on death at all. Within Harlem, Johnson's standing changed subtly but permanently. He was no longer just an enforcer or a gambler. He became, in effect, an arbiter, a man whose approval could stabilize entire blocks. This came with consequences. Police attention intensified, surveillance increased, files thickened. Johnson was arrested more than once, charged, released, and charged again. Each encounter with the justice system reinforced a truth he already understood. Informal power offered protection only within limits defined by the state. Yet even as legal pressure mounted, community loyalty deepened. When men were arrested, Johnson paid their legal fees. When families lost income, envelopes appeared without explanation. When disputes threatened to turn violent, his intervention prevented escalation. These acts did not erase his crimes, but they complicated his legacy. He was both predator and protector. Years later, journalists would struggle to categorize him. Was he a criminal exploiting Harlem's poverty, or a stabilizing force operating where formal institutions refused to serve? The answer, like most truths, resisted simplicity. Johnson aged in and out of prison. His body weakened. His authority slowly transferred to younger men who lacked his restraint. Harlem itself changed. New policies, new leaders, new tensions. The world that had shaped him began to disappear. But the lesson of the Cotton Club endured. Public humiliation, when left unanswered, spreads. When addressed strategically, it reshapes behavior far beyond the original offense. Johnson never sought to overturn the system. He learned to navigate it, exposing its contradictions, exploiting its blind spots, and forcing negotiation where none had existed. In the end, the door that denied him entry became a footnote. The response to it became the story, not because it was violent, but because it was disciplined. And in a city built on spectacle, discipline proved far more unsettling. History often simplifies men like Bumpy Johnson. It prefers clear categories, hero or villain, criminal or benefactor. But Harlem never experienced him in such clean terms. What it experienced was order in a place where chaos was the default, and mediation in a system designed to exclude. The Cotton Club incident endures not because of the insult itself, but because of the response it provoked. Johnson did not protest publicly. He did not plead. He did not attempt to shame the system into changing. He studied it, and then he applied pressure at the points where it was most vulnerable: money, cooperation, and legitimacy. There is an uncomfortable truth embedded in this story. The humiliation Johnson endured was legal. The club violated no written law. Segregation was protected by custom, policy, and silence. Yet the retaliation that followed, though illegal in form, exposed how dependent exclusionary systems were on the very people they marginalized. The Cotton Club could not function without black labor. Downtown operators could not profit without Harlem's participation, and power, stripped of consent, became fragile. Johnson's strategy did not dismantle racism. It did not reform the justice system, but it forced negotiation where arrogance had once been sufficient. This raises a difficult question. Is power defined by moral authority or by effectiveness? Johnson's methods came from the shadows. They were not virtuous. They relied on fear, leverage, and control. Yet for many in Harlem, those methods filled a vacuum left by institutions that offered no protection at all. When the law excluded them, they turned to a man who could not. That is not a defense. It is an explanation. Over time, Harlem would find new leaders. Laws would change. Segregation would be challenged openly rather than negotiated quietly, but the dynamics revealed in this moment would remain relevant. Public humiliation, when normalized, teaches submission. Strategic restraint, when paired with coordination, teaches consequence. Johnson understood that outrage burns quickly, discipline endures. He did not seek to be remembered as a reformer. He sought stability for himself and for the community that gave him power. Whether that stability justified the cost is a question history still debates. So the story ends not with a gunshot, but with a door that closed in a man's face and opened a lesson about power that traveled far beyond Harlem. If you were denied entry publicly, if your dignity were reduced to policy, would you shout or would you wait? And if you waited, what would you be willing to become in order to make the world listen? If you found this story meaningful, consider sharing your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this are not comfortable, but they are necessary. Subscribe for more untold histories where power, morality, and consequence collide.